Trump is back against all the odds, against my expectations. I thought he was done January the 6th, 2021. He's back. And voters who voted for him in 2016 and again in 2020 want another Trump term. Kamala Harris has never had to win a primary. She was handed the nomination in a coup d'etat because Joe Biden was manifestly too senile to win. He was going to lose, and he was going to lose big time. Trump's credibility partly comes from his unpredictability.
Yes.
Anybody who's spent time in Beijing, and I spent a lot of time in the Trump years at Tsinghua University, knows how much they hated his unpredictability. The Chinese, and I think the Russians, don't really know what to anticipate from Donald Trump, and that is, I think, an argument in favor of his being re-elected. It's not quite clear who is in fact in charge in Washington, D.C. And what is even more bizarre is that people take this for granted, almost regarded as normal.
So Niall Ferguson is a historian, an economist, and a profoundly insightful commentator. He's been kind enough to give us some time again today. Niall, it's terrific to see you back on these shores.
It's very nice to be back in Sydney after, 5 years.
Is it as long as that?
I have not been here since COVID struck.
Now, I've been struck by your modesty. You are now Sir Niall. You've been knighted and recognised, and very appropriately. It must feel in some way warm that you've been recognised after all the work you've done?
I don't know. Sir Niall has this faint Monty Python and the Holy Grail air about it, a little bit like Brave Sir Robin, and my children did point that out. There were questions about, are you one of the knights who say ni? And so ultimately it's just another way in which my family can tease me. But I think my mother was quite pleased. And my father would have been very pleased if he'd lived to see it. And that's the thing that makes it valuable. I was asked about this at the time that it was announced. And my response was, if you get an honour like this, the honour is really for the people who raised you and the people who educated you and the institutions that you owe things to. It's not really for the individual.
Well, I salute you for that attitude. And by the way, can I just begin by saying, this podcast series has been going now for about 6 years.
Is it really?
Gosh. Yes, it has. And it came out of a conversation with you and Anne Hersiali, your wife, after you were here in Sydney. It was an interesting conversation, and a friend and I said to you over coffee, could we put a version of that up there for people who weren't privy to that dinner and those conversations? You kindly said yes. The rest is history. I think we're on about 220 million YouTube downloads alone since then. So we're thankful for that too, out of Australia.
We knew back then.
Sorry?
I don't think that we knew 6 years ago that there was a market for intelligent conversation. I think that's been a bit of a surprise to me, especially that there could be so many people willing to listen to quite lengthy podcasts. So, pleasantly surprised for once.
Well, the only downside of it is I suspect that for authors like you, it means that you've got to find other conduits for reaching people. But you're right, we didn't realise how successful it would be and what an appetite there would be. And we now know in our own, we've had a fellow had a bit of a look at our own work. We're reaching younger people now too. They're interested in ideas and they're tuning in.
Well, that is encouraging to hear.
It is encouraging to hear. And before we get amongst it, you've got an alternative university going. How's that going in Austin? Why did you do it? How's it unfolding? And what are you seeing in the best of young thinkers at the moment?
Well, I think part of what's wrong in the Western world, and that's true in North America, I think it's true in Australia, it's certainly true in the UK, is that universities have been captured to a large extent by the so-called progressive left. And they've ceased to be places for free thinking and free expression and free debate. They've become places in which there's conformism and self-censorship and a really unpleasant intolerance. Every kind of diversity except intellectual diversity is how I'd sum up contemporary Harvard. And so I became impatient about this. And 3 years ago, Joe Lonsdale, Barry Weiss, and Pano Kanelos decided, damn it, let's start a new university and start from first principles and create a university that expresses what we passionately believe, which is that universities are places for the fearless pursuit of truth. We decided to do it in Austin. Everybody said it couldn't be done. 3 years later, our freshman class is, as we speak, studying hard, and that's very exciting. I mean, it's not big because it's a startup. We have 91 students. I imagine we'll admit 100 next year. But if you look at the early history of, say, the University of Chicago, it too started small. If we get it right, and I believe we will, we can scale rapidly over the next 10 years. And my goal is that by the 2030s, we'll be competitive with the Ivy League. And I think we will be competitive with them because we're offering something unique, a place where people really can pursue truth fearlessly. And that is attractive, especially to young people who, surprise, surprise, don't enjoy self-censorship and don't like being in classrooms that are suffocating with progressive orthodoxy.
Well, I think it's terrific. And, as we say at ARC, quoting Margaret Mead, it only takes a few people to change the world. Indeed, that's the only way it ever has changed.
Yeah, I mean, I was motivated by the belief that we had to create new institutions and that it was hopeless to sit around hoping that one could somehow recapture Harvard or Yale or Princeton. And once you realize that you can't recapture the established institutions, you either give up or create new institutions. I wrote a book called The Great Degeneration now more than 10 years ago, and one of its concluding arguments was we need new schools, we need to build new educational institutions. So I come finally practicing what I preach, I suppose.
There have been great formative moments in history. You've written about it extensively, including in the book you've just referenced, which was a terrific read. But you look at America, the largest economy on earth, etc. There have been those great formative moments. You could think the Civil War, you could think the Great Depression and the New Deal, you could think World War II, the Cold War. It looks like we're at another one of those moments. It doesn't look very reassuring at the moment, does it? What do you think might unfold in the next few years? What's the best we can hope for?
Well, American journalists always say that every presidential election is a decisive turning point in history, and so one has to sort of deflate a little bit and remind oneself that this does happen every 4 years. And every 4 years, the same kind of overexcitement and hyperventilation. The way I think about American history in our time is that in the wake of the victory in the First Cold War, the United States threw a kind of party. It was a peace dividend party. It was we're the only superpower party. It was let's now go global. It was the end of history, all of that good stuff. And that persisted despite the shock of 9/11. There was still a belief even after 2001 that you could ultimately remake the world in America's image. You could do it by force in Iraq and Afghanistan, or you could just do it through the market, through globalization in China. And that illusion, and it was an illusion, persisted all the way until 2016. It took, of all people, Donald J. Trump, reality TV star, New York property tycoon, to challenge the orthodoxies of the post-Cold War world. And he did that more successfully than many people have ever been willing to acknowledge. Example one, it was Trump who changed the American conversation on China. I mean, more or less single-handedly. And nothing that's happened since his defeat in 2020 has really changed the course of US policy towards China. Trump is back against all the odds, against my expectations. I thought he was done January the 6th, 2021. He's back. And voters who voted for him in 2016 and again in 2020 want another Trump term. That is where we are. And I think it makes a lot of sense because nobody else articulated the dissatisfaction of those people who were losing out economically and in other ways from globalization than Trump did. So here we are. I think Cold War II began some time ago. Not many people noticed. I think I've been saying this for 6 years, more or less since we first had these conversations. And Trump is a leader who has a response, who has a strategy for Cold War II, which is very appealing to American voters. Because what he says is, we don't want forever wars. We don't want your sons going off to faraway places. We don't want wars at all. We want peace through strength. Interestingly, a Ronald Reagan line. And in that sense, I think we're not in as bad a position as your question implied, We're in Cold War II, Americans kind of recognize that. And bizarrely enough, we've landed on Donald Trump as at least one plausible answer to the problem.
You and I have just been there. The feeling on the streets, if I were to summarise that at the moment, and look, I didn't talk to vast numbers, but did have the opportunity to talk to people who really follow these things pretty closely and have a feel for it, is that he has his nose in front at the moment. That in many ways, Kamala Harris, finally having agreed to do some interviews, actually was not able to convince people that there was a lot of the necessary depth there, to put it that way, for her to occupy the White House.
Well, a week is a long time in politics. A lot can still happen between now and election day. On the other hand, the voting has begun.
Yes.
And I think from what I can pick up, in the swing states that are really all important, there is some momentum with Trump, and Harris is losing momentum. Remember, Donald Trump won the Republican nomination fair and square in the primaries. He saw off a series of quite serious contenders. Ron DeSantis posed a real challenge. He saw him off. Kamala Harris has never had to win a primary. She was handed the nomination in a coup d'etat because Joe Biden was manifestly too senile to win. He was going to lose, and he was going to lose big time. And so it's not a fair fight, because Trump is a seasoned campaigner who won the presidential election in 2016, lost quite narrowly in 2020, and is up for his third shot. And Kamala Harris couldn't win a primary, got nowhere close to the nomination in 2020, and has been put in because it was clear that Biden was going to lose. The problem with Kamala Harris from the outset has been she may be younger than Joe Biden, but it's not obvious that she's smarter than Joe Biden. And in every case, whenever she's forced to ad-lib in interviews, when she doesn't have a teleprompter, when she hasn't been carefully rehearsed, she underperforms. Put it this way, Hillary Clinton was a more effective candidate than Kamala Harris, and clearly a smarter woman than Kamala Harris. And Hillary Clinton lost. Looking at the polling today, it's actually better for Trump than it was at this stage in 2016, and he went on to win. So although there are people in liberal land still clinging to the hope that Trump will say enough crazy things between now and election day to lose, I think if you and I went to, let's say, Northampton, Pennsylvania, a swing county in a swing state, we sat in a diner and we just eavesdropped on the conversations, I don't think the conversations would be about vibes. I don't think they would be about abortion, which is the most important issue that the Harris campaign relies on. I think people will be talking about Trump. Trump is always a topic of conversation. If he shows up in a McDonald's, as he did the other day,
he's just done.
If he narrowly escapes assassination, which of course happened in Pennsylvania, it seems to me that he just owns this election, and she can't get the traction she needs. It's still very close, so I'm not going to make myself look stupid by saying he's going to win. This is very, very tight. And there are states that we don't think about that are in contention in surprising ways. North Carolina, for example. But my sense is that the momentum, insofar as there is any, is with Trump, and the polling margins at this point, if you allow for the fact that they've tended to underestimate support for Trump in the past, do point to a Trump victory.
I was talking, as you do sometimes, in a cab to a cabbie, and he was telling me how terrible Trump is. And I thought, well, I'd better not be too rude. I'm in somebody else's country. But I just quietly said, if I were an American, one thing I'd be deeply offended about on the other side would be the way in which the Democrat machinery was, and very effective at it too, hid from me so long the true state of the national leader. And it came down to a debate when they could no longer deny it, when the whole nation knew the truth. Yeah. And I thought, if I were an American, I just said to this fellow, I'd feel that I had been treated with disdain and with great dishonesty. And he said to me, by the way, he conceded the point entirely.
Right. And that machine is a machine that includes substantial parts of the legacy or established media who contrive to conceal Biden's mental decay. Now, it didn't come as a great surprise to me. that debate because I had known Joe Biden since before he became president, and it had been obvious throughout the presidency that he had declined and was declining fairly steadily. It was an open secret in Washington. Anybody who was in the corridors of power knew that he couldn't go the distance in a full working day. But what's amazing is that even after the debate and after they decided, the Democrats who control the Democratic Party, that Biden had to go, he's still president. This man who is not capable of running for re-election is still president of the United States, the most powerful man in the world. And that in itself is bizarre. One senses, again, that the machine just keeps generating the big lie. It can't be the case that this very elderly man is running the federal government. It hasn't been true for some time. But who is? It clearly isn't Kamala Harris because she's running a campaign. So there's a very odd thing about America today. It's not quite clear who is in fact in charge in Washington, D.C. And what is even more bizarre is that people take this for granted, almost regarded as normal.
Another American said to me, and I found this very interesting, that in a list of 20 things he'd like to see as a self-confessed conservative, number one would be an election process that people had confidence in and couldn't question. And he made the comment, and I thought it was quite telling, that if it's close and there are any grounds for claiming that it wasn't a fair process, that will be disastrous for America.
Well, legislation was passed since the 2020 election, which eliminates quite a number of ways in which there could be a rerun of the debacle that followed that election. So I think it's unlikely to be as bad. Still, we are expecting a close result, and it would be very surprising if one candidate conceded gracefully. Hillary Clinton did not concede gracefully in 2016. Trump, of course, did not concede gracefully in 2020. So I think we've got to brace ourselves. It's also not clear that all the results will be in by the morning of November the 6th. It may be not until the end of the week that we know at least some congressional races. But I think it's worth remembering that there have been some important changes and legislation was passed to make it harder for there to be frivolous or cynical challenges to the result. I don't expect another January the 6th, to put it that way. But you've hit on an important point, and that is that the system still seems, in many respects, unsatisfactory. That's partly because of the bizarre opposition of the Democrats to clear voter identification rules, which certainly in the UK, and I imagine also in Australia, we would not think twice about challenging. Of course, you have to show that you are who you say you are when you turn up to vote. Elon Musk, who has become one of the most important variables in this election by throwing in his lot with Donald Trump and now campaigning very energetically for Trump, said the other day that as a technologist, he strongly opposed any kind of electronic mechanisms in voting, and that the system should revert to paper ballots counted by humans, the kind of system that you still see in the UK. You also have it in Taiwan, interestingly enough. And he said the problem with any kind of electronic system is one way or another it can be hacked. So maybe there's more reform in the future if Trump wins. It's interesting, this role that Musk is playing as a kind of surrogate for Trump. It's a very, very powerful addition to the campaign. I asked my 7-year-old son where he stood in the election the other night, and he said, "I'm voting for Elon." And a lot of young men who are entitled to vote, which he of course is not, may be feeling the same way. And that's interesting to watch. But I think it's interesting that on that issue, Musk is so unequivocally in favour of further reform.
Coming to where America goes policy-wise, we're sitting in Sydney, Australia, watching this. My view is that who the Americans choose at this time is probably more important than who we choose as the Prime Minister of Australia for Australians, frankly, given the state of the world today. The big and obvious question is the geopolitical mess that we face. I find the Democrats' lack of commitment to spending on defence quite disturbing. And I really wonder how committed Kamala Harris is. She referred to the most lethal military forces in the world, but one wonders whether she really would follow through. On the other hand, President Trump and much of the conservative end of the Republican Party do seem to be displaying some isolationist trends. How would you see it if you were an Australian? Well, you're a Brit, of course, in terms of the approaches they would take to the dangerous world we now live in?
Well, I am a US citizen as well as a UK citizen.
I should have remembered that.
It's worth saying so your viewers understand that I'm talking in my capacity as an American about this issue. But you're right that what the United States does matters for the entire Anglosphere. It matters for the UK. It matters for Australia. It matters for Europe. Mm-hmm. Indeed, it matters for the world. And so it's a very good question you've asked. Now, one of the problems Kamala Harris has is that she is in effect the incumbent. She's the vice president. She can't say she's a change candidate because she's been in office for the last 4 years nearly. And in that period, what have we seen? Declining military expenditure relative to gross domestic product and a succession of failures of deterrence. First in Afghanistan, the debacle that handed the country back to the Taliban. Then in Eastern Europe, the utter failure to deter Putin in 2022. Then in the Middle East, utter failure to deter Iran and its proxies. And by the way, a continued half-heartedness in response to Israel's justified retaliation. And who knows what comes next? Another 4 years of the Biden-Harris administration, only this time Harris is in charge, could hand Taiwan to China. I think that is a very important thing that Australians should be worried about. Bill Burns, Director of Central Intelligence, said twice last year, US intelligence is Xi Jinping has told the Chinese military to be ready for war in 2027. That is in the term of the next president of the United States. What happens if China imposes a blockade on Kamala Harris's watch? I don't know. Nobody knows. But it's very hard to feel great conviction that she, as commander-in-chief, will deter Xi from taking that kind of risk. So that's kind of point one. Point two is Donald Trump has been commander-in-chief. As president between 2017 and 2020, he actually performed pretty well in foreign policy terms. Never mind the tweets, focus on the outcomes. Did anybody declare war on a US ally in that time? No. Did the United States have to take large-scale military action in that time? No. Did Putin behave himself? Yes. Did Xi behave himself? Yes. Why? Because Donald Trump, for all his flaws, and I'd be the first to acknowledge he has many, does understand deterrence. He understands that the most effective way to avoid getting into a war is to project the credibility that you would retaliate if your foes took action. And I love the story, which you doubtless know, John, of Xi Jinping's visit to Mar-a-Lago. During the meal, Trump goes out in mid-meal before the dessert is served, and then returns after a pause and explains to Xi that he just had ordered missile strikes in Syria, and the dessert was duly served. I had a great conversation with Mike Pompeo recently, who, as you know, was Secretary of State for President Trump.
And a very good one, I thought.
Highly effective Secretary of State. And Pompeo made a very shrewd observation. He said, Henry Kissinger had to go and tell the Soviets that Richard Nixon was a madman and might escalate in Vietnam if they didn't help him end the war. But Pompeo said, I didn't have to tell anybody that Donald Trump was a madman. CNN did that for me. So Trump's credibility partly comes from his unpredictability.
Yes.
Anybody who's spent time in Beijing, and I spent a lot of time in the Trump years at Tsinghua University, knows how much they hated his unpredictability. And I can remember the story changing every year. Year one, he's a businessman. We understand businessmen. This is all going to be fine. But then when the tariffs came along, panic. He's a warmonger. He's a terrible person. The Chinese, and I think the Russians, don't really know what to anticipate from Donald Trump, and that is, I think, an argument in favor of his being re-elected. He has far more deterrence in his little finger than Kamala Harris has in her entire cabinet if she's re-elected.
When you talk the Middle East, it was relatively settled. It looks to me as though American foreign policy in the Middle East in the last 4 years has been terrible and has really encouraged the emergence of a very dangerous situation. But Trump recently indicated that the Israelis ought to go after the nuclear facilities and then clean up the mess later. Was he right, do you think?
Well, there's no question that something has to be done, or Iran is going to become a nuclear power with nuclear weapons. And if that happens, then everything changes.
Everything changes.
Irrevocably in the Middle East, and in a way that is profoundly dangerous to the state of Israel. The key thing to remember is that the theocratic regime in Tehran is committed to wiping Israel from the face of the earth and has been doing everything in its power to enable the terrorists who hate Israel and want to kill Israelis in recent years. I agree with you that US policy under the Biden-Harris administration has been very ineffectual in the Middle East. The best evidence for that was Jake Sullivan's very unfortunate piece in Foreign Affairs, published just before the October 7th, 2023 attacks. In the piece, he wrote that everything was looking really good in the Middle East and things had more or less been more peaceful there than in many years. Unfortunately for him, he went to press just before Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad launched their atrocious rampage and massacre. So that was the beginning, I think, of a series of errors of judgment. The United States has consistently called for a ceasefire. It's consistently called for Israel to give Hamas breathing space. Thankfully, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ignored these calls and has prosecuted an extraordinarily effective campaign of retaliation against Hamas, largely wiping out Hamas as a force in Gaza. And more recently and spectacularly, Mr. Netanyahu has taken out Hezbollah's leadership. He didn't just decapitate Hezbollah, he eviscerated it. This is an extremely impressive, almost Godfather quality process of retaliation. It reminds me of that scene where Michael Corleone, played by Al Pacino, is at the baptism of his child, and while the child is being baptized, all the enemies of the Corleone family are being taken out. Well, that's what Netanyahu has done, and he's done it against the advice, despite the pressure applied on him by Washington, D.C. And that's a remarkable achievement. It's hard for an Israeli leader just to ignore what the President of the United States is saying. But I think he was very right to do that. It's put Israel in a strong position because Iran's defenses were largely outside Iran. Hezbollah was the biggest deterrent against Israel attacking Iran's nuclear facilities. It's largely gone now, not wholly. And I think Israel has the opportunity right now, in the coming weeks and months, to take further military action directly against Iran, because Iran, after all, has directly attacked Israel twice. And although it's impossible for Israel single-handedly to wipe out Iran's nuclear facilities, it can set them back several years. And I think that that must be the right move to make at this point, whether or not the Biden-Harris administration supports it.
The right move for Israel, or the right move, in fact, for all of us?
I think it's the right move for Israel. I think it's the right move for all of us, because we can't possibly want Iran to become a nuclear-armed power. Even if Iran only used its weapons against Israel, John, I think we have a moral responsibility, we who are British, American, Australian, to ensure that there is never a second Holocaust. The state of Israel exists, ultimately, because of the Holocaust. Because the Holocaust showed that the Jews could not be safe without a state of their own. And I think we have a moral responsibility to ensure that there is no second Shoah. What Hamas did on October the 7th, 2023, was in effect a trailer for a second Holocaust. I know that's how my Jewish friends saw it. I know that's how my Israeli friends in particular saw it. I'm not a Jew myself, but I've spent a lot of my career studying Jewish history. I wrote a book in which the Holocaust plays a central role, War of the World. And so I recognized immediately what Hamas was trying to communicate. So I think it's extremely important to take Iran literally and seriously. There's no question in my mind that they wish to destroy Israel. If they have a nuclear weapon, we must take very, very seriously the danger that they would use it. And I don't think we can take that risk. None of us can take that risk.
It would surely also start an arms race right across the Middle East. The Saudis would feel they had to have nuclear armaments, which raises another interesting issue, of course, which is that despite our ambivalence in the West, we've not taken enough notice of the fact that many countries in the Middle East are plainly, quietly hoping that Israel will degrade Iran.
Well, this is one of the strategic things that Donald Trump got right in his first term, and that was to back reconciliation between Israel and its Arab neighbors and near neighbors. The Abraham Accords were one of the great achievements of the Trump administration, and that process could have carried on if Trump had been re-elected in 2020. Instead, it was derailed. We got a whole bunch of Obama holdovers back in Washington saying we need to resuscitate the nuclear deal with Iran. We know where that led. It relaxed the sanctions in Iran. The resources Iran got from selling its oil went straight to Hamas. But it's still possible to revive the Abraham Accords process. I think the Saudis would quietly welcome a return of negotiations with Israel and the United States. There is no great love lost for the Palestinians in Riyadh, in truth. And so I think if Trump is re-elected, there will be a resumption of that process that we saw in his first term. And that, I think, will help greatly to stabilize the region. Compared with 50 years ago, when you think back to the last surprise attack on Israel in 1973, Israel's much less isolated, in truth. It may look isolated at the United Nations General Assembly, but in the region it's much less isolated. And Bibi Netanyahu's grand strategy of putting the emphasis on Iran, emphasizing that it is the threat to regional stability, and trying to find common ground with the Arab states, has brought Israel out of real diplomatic isolation. So I think a tremendous opportunity has now arisen to break the Iranian theocracy and to create an enduring peace, not just between Israel and Egypt, that was done long ago, but throughout the region with the other Arab states, and particularly with the wealthy Gulf states, who in the end have far more important things to worry about, like what is their future in a post-hydrocarbon world, than the fate of the Palestinians. I said earlier this year at the Munich Security Conference, not every people gets a state. I'm a Scotsman, so I can speak with some authority on this. And I think the Palestinians had their chance of statehood and blew it. I don't think that chance comes back. I think after the opportunity was thrown away by Arafat, the opportunity that was presented in Oslo and subsequently, you just have to recognize that it's not going to happen. And no number of European governments recognizing a Palestinian state that clearly doesn't exist.
Include Australia in that.
It doesn't make any difference. In fact, it makes a farce of that process of recognition.
It's unrealistic.
Totally. There's nobody I met when I was in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv in February. Nobody, including my left-wing Tel Aviv friends, who still believes in a, quote, two-state solution. The response I got from pretty much everybody was, after October the 7th, you're going to reward them with a state? So I think that possibility has now largely gone in the region, and most people there recognize it. Quite why governments in Australia and in Europe think that they can make a Palestinian state come into existence by making bold declarations, I don't understand.
Well, that immediately raises something that really troubles me. Like you, I absolutely believe that a lot of this is because we've forgotten the Holocaust. I mean, it's extraordinary. You've had people on the progressive side of politics who participated in burning the place down, in protesting against racism, real and perceived, Black Lives Matter and all the rest of it. And we suddenly find that many of those very same people are actually at heart anti-Semitic. They've fallen for the oldest prejudice, ugliest racist form of racism of all, it seems to me.
It's been a very shocking thing for many people. Not so surprising to those of us who were living on university premises. One could see this toxic brew coming some time ago. It is a toxic brew because it combines different strains of anti-Semitism. There's the old Marxist-Leninist Soviet hostility to Israel, which really goes back to the Cold War. Then there's the Islamist anti-Semitism, which has been imported into campuses by the various organizations, often subsidized from abroad, that produced student groups in support of Hamas. And then there's just the old nasty bigotry that originated in the 19th century, if not earlier, and is still around and seldom far from the surface, especially amongst groups that protest their progressive bona fides. And this was a very toxic brew, but for most people it was invisible until October 7th. They couldn't believe their eyes when student groups, not only at Harvard, but at Columbia and at Stanford, came out in support of Hamas, the perpetrators of these hideous, unbelievably grotesque atrocities. That was a shocker. And it was, I think, a reminder to all of us of just how insidious anti-Semitism is, that it can morph, mutate, shapeshift, and turn up, of all places, on the far left. And then you're told by people on the far left, oh no, you're the fascists, and Israel is committing genocide. This is a really strange, topsy-turvy world in which people on the far left accuse Israel of genocide, when in fact the genocidal attack came from Hamas. And what Israel has done is to try to retaliate with the maximum attention to minimizing civilian casualties. It's very hard in Gaza. Anybody who's been there knows that Hamas inhabited tunnels underneath Gaza and used the Palestinian civilians as human shields. But if you compare the Israeli operation in Gaza with any similar military undertaking, actually the striking thing is the relatively low number of civilian casualties there have been. The term genocide has a history. It emerged from the Holocaust when Raphael Lemkin coined it and persuaded the new United Nations to make it a part of our system of international law. So to start using that term as a stick with which to beat Israel after attacks like those of October the 7th last year is completely bizarre to me and ought not to stand up to any slight scrutiny. What's baffling, really baffling to me, John, is that just in the last few days, there are young people in the streets of Australian cities expressing their solidarity with the leader of Hamas. I can't think of anybody who more richly deserved to be killed than that man. And they turn out to hear him praised as a martyr and a hero of jihad. Unbelievable.
I couldn't agree more, because what has happened to two things: our moral compass, that we should have got to that place, but also our understanding of our own interests. Because surely the reality is, surely it's obvious to anybody who gives it a moment's thought, that responsibility for the appalling scenes we see on the footage out of Gaza today lies solely with Hamas. They started it, they wanted it, they knew how to provoke it. They had kept quiet. Jake Sullivan fell into the trap for a couple of years. We know that. Give the impression it's all calm. Nothing's coming. So everyone relaxes. You have all of that going on. They at any point, they're the people who could have stopped it. Said, okay, we get the message. It's gone over the top, and we'll release the hostages and we'll stop it. And people want to blame Israel for what is plainly Hamas and its leadership's responsibility.
And let's not forget Hamas's popular support in Gaza, as well as on the West Bank. Substantial percentages, well over half of Palestinians, according to such polling as there is, support Hamas. So it's very difficult for this argument to pass muster when Israel is doing its level best to minimize the civilian casualties, to target the leaders of Hamas and then of Hezbollah. It must be said, this is impressive. I was inside the Israel Defense Ministry back in the spring and saw on the wall in one of the rooms I passed through a large wall chart with all of the Hamas leaders' photographs, most of them with red crosses through them. The same has been done to Hezbollah. It is hard to think of any precedent for this kind of extremely precision-focused warfare, directing your fire at the perpetrators of the crimes. It's a magnificent achievement. It's almost the opposite of genocide, because genocide, remember, implies the indiscriminate destruction of a people and that people's culture and language. This is the opposite of what the Israeli government has been doing since October the 7th. Now, when you see young people in universities or town centres around the world taking the side of terrorists, siding against the one democracy in the region that's trying to defend itself against terrorists, the phrase that comes to mind, John, is useful idiots.
Yes.
There have been useful idiots at various times in modern history. People who sympathize, young people who sympathize with violent extremists. There were useful idiots who sided with the Soviet Union in the mid-20th century and spied, in some cases, for the Soviets, betrayed their own countries. Think of the Cambridge Five. There were useful idiots in the 20th century too. And the people who today chant their support for Hamas, even as Hamas is being obliterated, are simply the useful idiots of our time.
So that's the sort of the moral case, and I entirely agree with you, and you put it beautifully. But then there's the self-interest case. Can't we see what a threat Iran, now teamed up with other opponents of the West, really are to us, and that our actual hard-nosed interests are surely best served by ensuring the degradation of that regime?
It's very important.
Its own people, I'm sure, long for that.
Well, that's
their
it.
own people.
Part one of the answer is yes. I mean, this is a deeply unpopular regime. There have been recurrent protests against it. Anybody who knows contemporary Iran knows the hatred that ordinary people feel for the regime. And it's devoutly to be wished for, as Mr. Netanyahu said just the other day, that there should be regime change in Iran. Nothing would benefit the people of Iran more than that. But you raise a geopolitical point, which I think is one of the most important to have emerged in the last 12 months. I don't think it was obvious a year ago that an axis was forming, an axis that brought China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea together. It's now unmistakable. And it was the war in Ukraine that brought these Axis powers together without Chinese support, without Iranian weaponry, without North Korean material, and now men. It is hard to see how Russia's war effort in Ukraine could have been sustained. But it's not only in Ukraine that they're cooperating. Russia is an extremely important player in the Middle East, has been since the Obama administration let the Russians get a foothold in Syria. And so Russia is keenly interested in what happens in the region. It has air defense systems in Syria, which are a great concern to the Israeli Air Force, very vulnerable to those defense systems. China, of course, is the number one buyer of Iranian oil. And the North Koreans, are essentially a criminal totalitarian regime, are merrily supplying men to Russia and weapons to all comers. So this is a new and frightening development, because this axis is in many ways more capable than the axis of the late 1930s. Now people forget this because the phrase axis of evil fell into some disrepute after 2001. It was in early 2002 that George W. Bush referred to the axis of evil in his State of the Union address, referring to Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. It didn't exist. It was made up by David Frum, his speechwriter. And I think many people kind of think axis, schmaxis. But this axis today is the real thing. Yeah. And we can see the extent of the cooperation, economic and military, growing with every passing month. This should concern us very much. And so what would be better for us all than for one of these Axis powers to crumble? There's no doubt that Iran is the most vulnerable. Its leader is very elderly, Supreme Leader Khamenei, almost certainly the first of the Axis leaders to die. And its regime is detested by the population. So I egg Mr. Netanyahu and his cabinet colleagues on, finish the job, and remember, your position is a great deal stronger than your counterparts 50 years ago, who were much more reliant on American aid than Israel is today.
My guess is that their determination, their courage, their ingenuity, the impressive performance they've put in against Hezbollah in particular, might have steeled many in the West to ask the obvious question: if they believe in themselves, are we not, in part, in large part in trouble because we no longer believe in ourselves. You and I have talked about this before. Perhaps the greatest threat of all is that the West lost its history, doesn't believe in its own legitimacy. Even now, if it got serious, and I'm talking about my own country more than any other, where we talk the talk and will not walk it on defence preparedness, on secure supply chains, all the things that would help us going if something went wrong, we just will not step up and actually do anything. We just talk about it. This crisis of belief in ourselves, we're going to pay a terrible price for it, I suspect, in every sense, if we're not prepared to wake up.
I would be more pessimistic if I did not see clear signs of a change, a sea change in the United States. And funnily enough, it's come in the place you perhaps would least have expected it, Silicon Valley. Now, for years, it seemed as if Silicon Valley was uniformly blue, towing the Democratic line, and essentially indifferent to geopolitics. But that has changed. Palantir, a company that used technology to greatly enhance US and other Western governments' intelligence capabilities, Anduril, the new generation defense tech company, and others less well known, are part of a dramatic change that has happened on the West Coast in just the space of 4 years. We have gone from la la land to a realization that if the tech sector does not get up and running a new generation of weaponry, a new generation of warfare, then the United States and the West as a whole will be in deep trouble. But I find it quite inspiring that so many people from the world of technology have now become directly involved in the effort to modernize our defense capabilities and our intelligence capabilities. It's frustrating. If I talk to people in Silicon Valley about their dealings with Washington, the complaints are familiar. The defense procurement process is an incredible labyrinth. The established defense companies, the defense primes, overcharged by a factor of 10 and are 10 years out of date. I hear these complaints. But these are the complaints you make when you're making change happen. And I do think that change is happening, and it's happening very rapidly indeed. Just to give you one example, it's fairly clear that Indo-Pacific Command, which is in many ways the most important of the American commands from an Australian perspective, has been revising its doctrine in response to the Chinese threat to Taiwan and indeed in the South China Sea. And as it revises its doctrine, it's clear that drones are going to play a much larger role in American war preparedness than they did before. Just a couple of months ago, Admiral Sam Praparo, the new commander of Indo-Pacific Command, said that in the event of a Chinese blockade of Taiwan, his job would be to turn the Taiwan Strait into, quote, a hellscape. And he meant by that he would be using unmanned sea weaponry to destabilize China's military and naval maneuvers. So there's change in the air, John. I think you're right to say that Australia and the UK, the other parts of AUKUS, are pretty much asleep at the wheel. But the United States is not. And even although the Biden-Harris administration has set us on a path where defense spending will gradually get squeezed over the coming years, that is definitely not the mood in Silicon Valley. And I think, depending on the outcome of the election, there is a decent chance that we'll see a rapid modernization and an improvement of America's deterrent in the next 4 years.
A couple of questions out of that then. It becomes critically important that we don't let the Chinese win the AI race. And that technological cutting-edge capacity that America's known for, can it stay in front?
Well, it's in front now. The Chinese really have struggled to keep pace with the large language model revolution. They're doing pretty well. I don't want to give the impression that it's all over. It's probably about as close as the US election, in fact. But the Chinese are laboring under some important handicaps, including the restrictions imposed by the US Commerce Department that limit their access to the most sophisticated GPUs, the most sophisticated microprocessors or semiconductors that come out of Taiwan, come out of TSMC. I think the AI race is crucial. So is the quantum race, which is the other big technological frontier that's relevant here. And my sense is that the US has an edge, not in terms of raw numbers of PhDs. The Chinese throw PhDs at their research and development on a massive scale. But in terms of quality, the US is still ahead. There are only a few areas where I think that's not true. I'd be quite concerned, for example, about robotics, where China seems to be forging ahead. But in AI, it looks to me as if the United States has a lead, and it's not obvious to me how China can really catch up as long as it can't make its own GPUs.
And the second part of that, the question that arises out of what you said a moment ago, hardware, and that's requires big bucks and real expenditure. America is very stretched financially. I can't believe the lack of fiscal discipline. It's extraordinary. Have they got the hardware? I mean, China has more ships, but America has greater tonnage. It's only part of the answer. It's technological capability. I mean, have they got that cutting edge? Can they do what might be necessary in the Taiwan Straits?
This is a really key question, and it's quite a complex one. First of all, the fiscal side. Yes, the United States federal government has been spending like the proverbial drunken sailor. To have a deficit of about 7% of GDP at full employment is indefensible. And the Biden administration has been very fiscally irresponsible. It's driven the debt up above 100% of GDP. More troublingly, it's set the US on a path that is even less sustainable than it was 4 years ago, and it wasn't particularly good then. In fact, pretty much since the turn of the century, successive administrations have failed in their duty to stabilize fiscal policy. That matters because although the world seems to have an insatiable appetite for dollars and 10-year Treasury bonds, the cost of servicing an ever larger stock of debt, even with interest rates coming down, is still very high over time. The Congressional Budget Office tries to project this. As far as I can see, we're already spending more on interest payments on the federal debt than on defense. That's this year for the first time.
That's pretty frightening.
And that delta, the gap between debt service and defense, is going to be roughly double by the time we get to the, say, 2040. That's a really unsustainable path. I came up with the idea of Ferguson's law to try to crystallize this. That Ferguson's law states that when a great power is spending more on interest payments on its debt than on defense, it won't be great for much longer. And it's true right the way through history. You go all the way back to the Dutch Republic, the Spanish Empire of the Habsburgs, the Bourbons of 18th century France. You look at the Turks in the 19th century, Britain in the 20th, it's always the case that once the debt reaches a certain point, you start not having the resources to maintain your empire's military capability. So there's no doubt that there's a problem there. And the US has got to do something about it. And neither Donald Trump nor Kamala Harris has remotely addressed this question. If anything, Trump seems to imply an even more spendthrift fiscal policy. That's part one of my answer. There's a fiscal problem. Part two is more subtle. It is not clear to me that the defense budget needs to be spent on building the technology of the 20th century over again. It should not be spent, in my view, on aircraft carriers or strategic bombers. We need to spend our defense dollars on the new generation of weapons. We all know that includes drones and that drones are cheap. What matters is mass. You want autonomous mass, lots and lots of autonomous drones that are hard to shoot down. Not that expensive.
Swarming capacity.
Right. But you need more. In particular, you need to have extremely resilient satellite systems because everything in modern warfare depends on those. Space war is not just some slogan, it's a reality. And Space Force is as crucial as the Air Force, it's as crucial as the Marine Corps in modern warfare. And so I really want to see the US upping its game in space because there are real threats there. Luckily, we've had one man in the private sector doing the work that the Pentagon wasn't doing, doing the work that NASA wasn't doing the work that Boeing couldn't do, and that's Elon Musk, whose incredible SpaceX company has blazed a trail in space that has left China in the dust. In terms of satellite coverage, Starlink has been completely transformative for people all over the world.
Absolutely.
But also for Ukraine when the chips were down in 2022. Without Starlink, Ukraine would have lost the war quite quickly because all their other communications were knocked out. So I'm not entirely pessimistic because I do see such innovative strength in the US private sector. And if we can only harness that by reforming procurement, by stripping out the bureaucracy that, of course, has accumulated at the Pentagon, by making sure that the people in the Pentagon prioritize war readiness, not DEI, which I sometimes think they care more about. If we can do those things, then all is by no means lost.
Coming to China, because what happens there is very important. Now, effectively, Xi has, as one of my guests put it, made the Communist Party in his own image, and the Chinese people in the image of the Communist Party. He's got total control. And yet he's presiding over a weakening economy, a place where the world is now deeply suspicious of China and is starting to take, tariffs being an obvious example, all started by Trump, and now we all recognise the challenge we have. They've got a massive debt problem. They've got a depopulation bomb about to hit. Are the next few years the most dangerous, do you think, in terms of China and adventurism and expansion? Will there be a time when their internal pressures mean they're less able, less willing, less focused on seeking to make trouble? Indeed, at the pointy end of the question, I suppose, is President Xi actually, has he so isolated himself that he might not actually understand what's happening and say, right, we're taking on Taiwan, when his generals and so forth might want to say, actually, we're not ready, but they wouldn't be brave enough. He's so isolated himself.
It's hard to believe that even with modern technology, any one person can be in total control of what isn't quite a fifth of humanity. It's, I guess, closer to 15% now. But I was in Beijing in May, and I was struck, as often, by the complexity of China's system. The big man, he's very rarely referred to by name, is a ubiquitous presence in people's minds, and there is fear in Beijing in a way that there wasn't really 10 or 15 years ago. On the other hand, the big man can't be everywhere all the time. And what I'm struck by is the tension that exists between the people on the economics side, who have to worry about the falling rate of growth and the fundamental structural problems of the economy that you just referred to, the demographics, the debt, and particularly the real estate sector, and the national security people on the other side, who give the impression that they are preparing for war at some point in the relatively near future. And there's clear tension between these two camps. There are plenty of people in the Chinese government who had part of their education in the United States and who understand fully well the problem with an economic model that constantly prioritizes industrial production over household consumption. I mean, they're not fools. On the other hand, they're constrained by the big guy. I think one of the things that struck me in May was the extent to which those economics-minded people were working to persuade the big guy that there was a problem. And I think what we learned at the third plenum earlier this year was that they got through. There has been a realization at the very highest level that there is a problem. And so the monetary easing and the announcements of fiscal stimulus that we've had in the past month or so are a sign that the economists are making some headway. I don't think it'll be enough, because I think China's problems are very profound and probably beyond simple monetary and fiscal remedies. But that's interesting to me, and it suggests he's not out of touch. Just in the same way that zero COVID was abandoned when the message got through to the big guy that it was no longer sustainable because the students in Tsinghua were beginning to protest. Never a good sign in Chinese history. But you asked the right question, John. Are we in the moment of maximum danger in the next few years? I think we are. Because I think if you look over a 10-year time horizon, it's very hard for me to see that China is, in 10 years' time, more likely to be able to take Taiwan than it is in the next 3 years. Because if you take a 10-year view, let's assume that the US continues down the sort of road that I can imagine, where the technological advances get taken on board by the Pentagon, Indo-Pacific Command ups its game, becomes better able to deter China. The trend is not his friend not demographically, not economically, and I don't think it's his friend in military terms. So in the sense, if he's going to have as the capstone of his whole career that Taiwan follows Hong Kong under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, not just in name but in practice, then he's got to act relatively soon. And that's why 2027 seems like a key date, because beyond that, not only do China's chances, I think, steadily decrease, but he gets old. I mean, he's not immortal any more than Putin is. I mean, at some point, these guys age out. And that's the problem that all these so-called Axis powers face. They have poor succession plans, with the possible exception of North Korea, which is in effect a kind of royal system of totalitarian succession. Every other one of them has a succession problem. Nobody knows who succeeds Khamenei in Tehran. Nobody knows who succeeds Putin in Moscow, and nobody knows who succeeds Xi in Beijing, because they all don't have any kind of conventions. Whereas we have elections. I mean, they're messy and crazy and people say stupid stuff. But in the end, we renew our leadership. We do it, and we do it pretty well and pretty peacefully with occasional moments of madness. So I think that's why, in the long run, the West wins Cold War II. But in the short run, we risk the kind of crisis that John F. Kennedy faced in 1961 and 62, first Berlin, then Cuba. And the analogy, I'm sure we've discussed it before because I've been saying this for years, is with the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The Taiwan semiconductor crisis of, let's say, 2027 will be the most dangerous moment of Cold War II. And everybody has to make sure between now and 2027, we're doing all that we can to deter Xi Jinping from doing the kind of dumb thing that Putin did in Ukraine in February of 2022.
A good note then to wind up on. I think it's fair to say that the Alliance of Responsible Citizens is about saying decline is not inevitable. We need to believe in ourselves. We need to restore confidence, learn from the mistakes of the past, but stand on the shoulders of giants who gave us the freedom and prosperity that we take far too lightly. I think we demean ourselves when we fail to recognise what we have and who gave it to us. I think it's fair to say we're both believers in that mission, and we think it can create a valuable in-country and inter-country forum for unpacking bad ideas, if you like, promoting good ideas.
One reason that I got involved with ARC is the belief that we've got to organise and we've got to create new institutions, and above all, we've got to build a network of concerned citizens. This is not a political project. It's not a conservative project.
No, it's not.
Because I think liberals and conservatives have a common interest in the foundations of a free society. We all benefit from the rule of law. We all benefit from a healthy market economy. Those things should not be subjects of debate between conservatives and liberals. And what we want, above all else, is for our children and our grandchildren to enjoy the benefits of freedom that we've enjoyed. And we enjoyed them because our grandfathers fought for them. John, my grandfathers fought in the world wars, not for themselves. They fought for me before I was born. Yeah. And that's what ARC is about. It's about trying to give ourselves that same sense of duty to posterity that my grandfathers had from the time they were teenagers. So it's not a political project, ARC. It's about trying to revive those essential, vital institutions and ideas that have been the basis for Western prosperity and Western freedom for centuries. I can't think of a better way of spending the remainder of my life than trying to make sure that my children and grandchildren enjoy those benefits.
Couldn't agree with you more. And really, a serious thinking person to the left, of the centre left, should actually welcome this on the basis that contestability of ideas, probing one another's strengths and weaknesses in the public domain and the public policy debate is surely better for everyone.
Absolutely. And I have many friends in the academic world who consider themselves to the left of me, on the left, whether they call themselves liberals or whatever they want to call themselves, who share my conviction that we must all pursue truth together through open argument, not through censorship, but through open debate. So I'm confident that we've kind of passed that point when it seemed as if the left had decided to go full illiberal, full intolerant, go down the road of imposing conformity and orthodoxy. Somehow or other, in all of its horror, the events of October the 7th last year had one silver lining. They shone a bright light on what was rotten on the left, and forced many liberals to realize that they had got into bed with some pretty unsavory characters. Now, I don't expect them to love conservatives. I don't expect them to come back to classical liberalism. That's not in my mind's eye. But what I do hope is that we resume civil debate on these very difficult issues. It's hard. There are trade-offs. How do you resolve the problem, the strategic threat that the Axis poses without imposing intolerable tax burdens that end up slowing the economy down? How do you address the kinds of problems that face farmers in Australia, or for that matter in Scotland, but also address the problems of people living in inner cities who have very different priorities? These are not easy things. But one thing is surely clear from the last 200 years of history. You don't arrive at good solutions to those problems with 5-year plans, censorship, and a one-party regime. You only arrive at good solutions through open debate. That's what I believe in, that's what ARC is about, and that's why I'm here in Sydney.
It's been a great privilege, it always is.
Thanks,
You've
John.
been incredibly kind with your time.
Thank you.